mainly promote interparliamentary dialogue, particularly among members of the OSCE PA, on the most pressing issues on the global agenda. We're pleased to have such high interest from members of Parliament, and are particularly pleased we're joined today by two high-level expert speakers, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Thank you very much for your readiness to contribute to this policy debate. Our discussion today is a continuation of the series of parliamentary web dialogues we began following the onset of the pandemic in areas of particular focus and priority for the OSCE PA. These discussions aim to address issues relevant to the political and security dimension, the economic dimension, as well, of course, as human rights and humanitarian issues. Today, we turn our attention to focus on humanitarian protection and human rights in conflict zones. This has long been a focus of the leadership of the OSCE PA's Human Rights Committee, so I'm pleased that we have this opportunity today. The continued impact of conflict means that this topic, quite tragically, remains very relevant. Let me just mention a few technical aspects. I'll let our guest speakers introduce today's discussion, but just a few details prior to that. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and broadcast live on YouTube and Facebook. If you have any connection problems, please contact our team, who will do their best to support you. Their contact details will be put in the chat function that you're seeing on within WebEx. We have two-language interpretation into English and Russian. Please note that listening to the interpretation requires a separate device. You should all have received information to connect to this Interprefy service. If not, please let us know and we'll make sure to provide you with the necessary support. Any requests for the floor should please be written in the webinar's chat. I'll try and make sure then to give you the floor during the debate. With that, we have limited time and it's a big topic, so we'll move straight ahead. I'm pleased to first give the floor to ask Mr. Kyriakos Hajiani, Member of Parliament from Cyprus and the Chair of the OSCE PA's Human Rights Committee, to say a few words to introduce our topic. Following that, we'll have remarks from the two renowned speakers, and after that, we'll have time for discussion among members. Anybody that may know that they're already interested in intervening in the discussion are welcome to already note that in the chat function now, please. Without further ado, I will ask Mr. Hajiani to please say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Good afternoon to everybody. Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, thank you very much for being here today with and watch all this interesting meeting. While COVID has unfortunately meant that we could not meet in the past year, our shift to online events has enabled us to focus on some additional topics of great importance. Last year, we held several events to discuss in some detail issues related to human rights during states of emergency, diversity, challenges, and opportunity, as well as other key topics. As chair of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs Committee, I welcome these opportunities for dialogue. I'm pleased to welcome you today to discuss one of the most pressing but also persistent problems within the OSCE area, the lack of adequate humanitarian protection and respect for human rights in conflict zones. Throughout the last year, we have sadly witnessed the repeated resort to the use of force and the resumption of hostilities, causing immense hardships for the affected populations. Among others, the war in eastern Ukraine has now dragged on for the better part of a decade, leaving 1.5 million people internally displaced. Although measures to strengthen the ceasefire last year resulted in a significant decline in civilian casualties, injuries from unexploded ordnance remain high. We should absolutely welcome that there are fewer direct casualties of the conflict, but the impact of the conflict remains intense, including several restrictions on the freedom of movement. Last fall, we were also horrified to see fresh fighting in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. In the 6 weeks until a ceasefire entered into effect on 19 November 2020, around 6,000 Azerbaijani and Armenian service people were reportedly killed. I am certain that I was not the only one that was shocked by the horrific images of violence, and that I would not stand alone in calling for an urgent and thorough investigation into all allegations of war crimes. Indiscriminate attacks on civilian neighborhoods, report for extrajudicial executions, and the mistreatment of prisoners of war all constitute grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, which must not be ignored. Similarly, we cannot forget the ongoing crisis in Georgia, Moldova, and elsewhere, where citizens still suffer from the long-standing division of communities and unwarranted obstructions to their daily life. My own country of Cyprus is a vivid example of the long-standing impact of such divisions. And let us not forget that each year many tons of unexploded yet dangerous bombs are unearthed dating back to the First and Second World Wars. What we do today, can we have impact for generations even after the guns have fallen silent? I believe that it is our task as parliamentarians to rally together to hold our governments to account and to work on behalf of all those who are impacted and who have lost their dignity or property to the scourge of war. Observers, activists, and journalists are just some of the partners that we must work with in this endeavor. I'm very much look forward to our conversation. After all, it is only once we afford the human rights and humanitarian protection due to each and every one of our constituents that we can claim to have attained the notion of comprehensive security. I want to thank our expert guests for joining us today. The impact made by both the Red Cross over many decades and by the OSCE's monitoring mission in Ukraine is well known and deeply appreciated. I look forward to hearing your perspectives. And thank you also to all of my parliamentary colleagues for joining today. With almost 50 parliamentarians joining, I can see that this is a topic of great interest. I hope that we will all engage in a constructive and forward-looking discussion that helps serve the interests of all of our populations. Thank you. I now ask Andreas Baker in the Secretariat to please help facilitate the rest of our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hajiani. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our two high-level speakers, whose contributions I'm sure will be invaluable. So today we first welcome a leading voice in the field of humanitarian diplomacy, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mr. Peter Maurer. As most of you will know, the Icrc operates worldwide, helping people affected by conflict and armed violence and promoting the laws that protect victims of war. The ICR's mission to prevent suffering by promoting and strengthening humanitarian law and universal humanitarian principles is directly relevant to our discussion today. President Maurer himself brings a wealth of experience to his role, having served in a range of high-level diplomatic positions on behalf of Switzerland. Mr. Maurer has made it a priority during his presidency to strengthen humanitarian diplomacy, engaging states and other actors for the respect of international humanitarian law and improving humanitarian response through innovation and new partnerships. Ambassador Maurer, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker, parliamentarians. I really appreciate the opportunity to exchange with you today. I appreciate the ongoing dialogue between OSCE and my organization and our shared humanitarian interest. Before delving into the themes of concern in the OSCE region, please allow me to say a few words about the global issues of common interest to the OSCE and to Icrc. At the global level, the ICRC engages on policy discussions with governments, parliamentarians, and other actors on a wide range of topics. For example, since the outbreak of the pandemic, ICRC engaged on COVID-19 as a global health emergency, as well as on humanitarian consequences of the wide-ranging socio-economic secondary effects. We have worked and continue to work to ensure the protection of the most vulnerable population and ensure that the aftermath of pandemic does not weaken international legal frameworks, but rather strengthen them. We are also investing in our collective capacity to deal with climate change and to address humanitarian concerns where climate vulnerabilities and conflict coincide, and to mitigate the impact of these shocks for stability of entire regions. We look forward to engage with OSCE members on these and other challenges of global interest and to identify solutions together. Zooming to the OSCE region, I will now highlight some of the key challenges facing civilians in conflict areas and offer suggestions on the important role states and parliamentarians can play. Across the region, the ICRC observes key trends with deep impacts for the civilian population, from death and injury to the destruction of essential infrastructure and the threats to people's dignity. The primary impacts of hostilities on people's physical and mental health, their livelihoods, as well as critical infrastructure. The harm caused by weapon contamination in populated areas. Mr. Hajianai has mentioned it in his introduction. The lack of access to essential services such as health, water, electricity services. The protection of those most at risk, including the elderly, children, displaced and detained person, and finally, the search of the missing persons to bring peace to families and communities. The immediate humanitarian impact of conflict is evident. During the escalation of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the ICRC received reports of indiscriminate shelling and other alleged unlawful attacks using explosive weaponry in cities, towns, and other populated areas in which civilians died, were injured, and where key infrastructure was destroyed. For weeks, families, including children and babies, retreated underground to unheated basements, sheltering day and night from violence. Many also had to flee the conflict zone to take precarious shelter further afield. We saw individuals unable to access important services, left out in the cold, losing their ability to earn a living, and provided for their families, children unable to attend schools, and many unable to receive treatment for pressing health needs or take adequate preventive measures. In Ukraine, after a period of relative calm under a fragile ceasefire, hostilities are again on the rise. Any intensification is affecting the well-being and drains the livelihoods of people and communities. Children and adults in the conflict area continue to suffer from the fear of shelling and bombs explosions, and even go to schools situated at the very contact line. This is also true in eastern Ukraine, where crossing the line of contact remains a dangerous but often inescapable daily reality, with around 1 million people crossing every month prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. When I visited in November Ukraine last year, I saw the tragic impact for many when the line cannot be crossed. Hundreds of thousands of older people cut off from family members and unable to access the pensions they are entitled to after decades of work. Weapon contamination, mines and unexploded ordnances is another important humanitarian protection concern, causing death, injury, and significant limiting access to arable land for years, sometimes decades. Eastern Ukraine, sadly, counts among the most contaminated areas worldwide. The confusion, displacement, and death that accompanies conflict often puts families in an agonizing position of not knowing what has happened to their loved ones. Particularly the Balkans continue to face the legacy of thousands gone missing during the wars in the 1990s. In the context of the conflict surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh, the number of cases left unresolved for almost 3 decades are now compounded by the cases of the 2020 escalation. Working with the families of the missing and engaging the authorities on this matter remain a priority of the ICRC in the OSCE region. The process of tracking down the missing can be difficult. Right now, for example, Unexploded ordinances make the task of collecting dead bodies increasingly challenging in and around the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Cooperation with local authorities and other actors is crucial, and the ICRC appreciates the positive interaction with the sides on the ground, as well as with the peacekeeping forces of the Russian Federation, to facilitate humanitarian operations such as the transfer of bodies. I would like also to take this occasion to remind you that the conflict parties have a duty to search for and to collect the dead, treat the mortal remains with respect, and organize the return of the relevant mortal remains to the opposite side. And finally, the surge of the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated vulnerabilities. In Ukraine, crossing the line of contact became even more challenging. Economic disruption from the pandemic is having a severe impact on people's income and ability to earn. Importantly, the impact on people's mental health cannot go unnoticed, especially those who have already lived with the impact of years of conflict. Despite the scale of these humanitarian protection concerns, they are not insurmountable. As parliamentarians, you have the potential to influence your respective states' laws and their commitment to strengthen the OSCE's comprehensive approach to security, which includes human security. More specifically, parliamentarians can make contributions in 5 specific areas. First, to ensure international humanitarian law is respected by all sides and at all times. The ICRC has long-standing experience in supporting state parties to the Geneva Conventions and other on IHL. And an initiative I would like to highlight in this regard is our ongoing work with the military and other armed actors to identify ways of ensuring respect for IHL in the context of partnered operations. We are due to release a new comprehensive publication on the subject, which my colleagues and myself would gladly share with you and discuss with you further on. Secondly, restrictive measures or sanctions must not unduly interfere with impartial, neutral, and independent humanitarian action. We recognize states' concerns and their responsibility to take measures to ensure their security, but they must also ensure their responsibilities to ensure vulnerable populations are protected. Neutral, independent, and impartial humanitarian aid and protection must be allowed to function unhindered. Neutral, independent, and impartial humanitarian work and its contribution to stability is a critical building block in laying the foundations for overcoming the conflict. Thirdly, relevant laws are in place and implemented which support humanitarian aid and protection. A good examples are laws that facilitate the search for the missing that were recently passed in Ukraine. The issue of missing is one of which parties can reach mutual agreements on humanitarian grounds to share information or allow the return of remains, potentially healing deep scars in communities. It is also an issue in which you, as parliamentarians across the OSCE region, can play a positive role. Fully implementing relevant laws can significantly accelerate the search for the missing and contribute to reconciliation. Fourthly, that humanitarian action is adequately resourced. Unfortunately, as states are grappling with crises upon crises globally, the humanitarian needs caused by conflicts in the OSCE region risks being overlooked and remained notoriously underfunded. As parliamentarians, you have an important role to play in ensuring that humanitarians' contributions do not dwindle further. I hope that today's discussion will contribute to raising awareness of the persistent human suffering and help making humanitarian action financially sustainable. And fifthly, that public discourse does not politicize or criminalize humanitarian action. The marginalization of vulnerable groups or the spreading of misinformation can severely limit policymakers' choices and exacerbate humanitarian protection concerns. Allow me one point of urgency in this regard that affects the majority of the OSCE participating states: the fate of foreign nationals in conflict zones. Whether they are former fighters or civilians, they need to be treated in accordance with existing international and legal frameworks. People, and especially children, should not be made stateless or left in inhumane conditions. Likewise, Migrants deserve the protection that is afforded to them by international and national frameworks. And in conclusion, 2020 was a year of many challenges. 2021 may yet be a continuation of that, but we also saw people persevere. At the Icrc, we managed to keep operations going and adapted to the new realities. Last year, the OSCE reaffirmed its resolve to include a human security dimension with its deliberations. I strongly believe that respect for international humanitarian law and neutral, independent humanitarian action will not only alleviate and prevent suffering, but also provide practical pathways to stability. I encourage you, as parliamentarians, to push for policies and behaviors that are aligned with IHL, international humanitarian law, and supportive of humanitarian action. The escalation of conflict in and around Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as recent flare-ups of violence in eastern Ukraine, are a stark reminder that conflict can re-erupt anytime, even in Europe. These events are also a reminder that a swift and meaningful humanitarian response depends on being trusted by all sides. Such trust does not go overnight. We will continue our work in partnership with our Red Cross and Red Crescent movement partners. We also stand ready to work with you to strengthen our collective response to alleviate human suffering and to protect the most vulnerable across the OSCE region and globally. I thank you, Mr. Baker, and I thank you, parliamentarians, for having me this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maurer. We'll move directly on then. Our next speaker is Ambassador Yasser Chevik, Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. As you may know, the SMM is an unarmed civilian mission of some 1,300 staff present in all regions of Ukraine. Its main tasks are to observe and report in an impartial and objective way on the situation in Ukraine and to facilitate dialogue among all parties to the crisis. The SMM's work has a very direct impact on the lives of many in the country, including through continued facilitation and monitoring localized ceasefires to enable such things as repairs and maintenance of civilian infrastructure on both sides of the contact line. Ambassador Chevik similarly brings important diplomatic experience to his work, having served in several high-profile diplomatic posts on behalf of Turkey. Ambassador Chevik, thank you for joining us. We look forward to hearing your perspective and benefiting from your expertise in this field. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Baker, Mr. Hajiyannis. Nice to see you again. Distinguished participants, thank you for this opportunity to present the work of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine and share with you some observations regarding the impact of the conflict on civilians, which the mission monitors and reports on daily and weekly basis. Just a couple of weeks ago, I also shared some messages in that regard with your colleagues in the General Committee on Political Affairs and Security. In accordance with its mandate, the aim of SMM is to reduce tensions and foster peace, stability and security, to monitor and support the implementation of all OSCE principles and commitments, and to monitor and support respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the right of persons belonging to national minorities. We are doing this by, inter alia, establishing and reporting facts and engaging with local, regional, and national authorities, civil society, ethnic and religious groups, and civilians on both sides of the contact line. Our findings are made public in our daily and thematic reports. As you can see in our reports, civilians living near the contact line in eastern Ukraine remain highly vulnerable and exposed to severe hardships. Since the agreement reached by the sides on the measures to strengthen the ceasefire on July 22nd last year, the SMM has observed a much improved security situation on the ground. Regrettably, however, the SMM continues to monitor and report on civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure and property, especially after the second week of November 2020, when for the first time since after July 27th, the SMM corroborated civilian casualties due to shelling, damages to houses, and a school. The mission also regularly receives reports about civilians' lack of access to basic services, including to education and health, and other basic rights and freedoms, such as freedom of movement across the line of contact. The gradual fraying of the ceasefire has been reported by the SMM since November last year. It is a cause for grave concern, as it has an immediate impact on the lives of affected civilians. The working group on security issues of the Trilateral Contact Group, which I coordinate, addresses inter alia some security-related aspects of certain humanitarian issues, including with regard to crossing routes and protection of critical civilian infrastructure. However, discussions in our working group are at an impasse, and agreements on initiatives which would have benefited civilians are yet to be finalized. I assure you that I constantly encourage participants to be mindful of the importance of humanitarian considerations in our discussions and remind them that humanitarian issues should not be politicized. Civilians continue to be killed and injured due to the conflict. In 2020, the mission confirmed 131 civilian casualties. 24 were killed and 170 were injured. 56 occurred as a result of shelling, and 67 were caused by mines and UXOs, and 8 were due to small arms and light weapons fire. Casualties included 11 boys and 6 girls. Following the measures to strengthen ceasefire to effect on 27th of July, there has been a decrease in civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire. Only 3 civilian casualties due to shelling have been corroborated since that date. However, the mission is still in the process of corroborating a further 17 civilian casualties, including 15 reported since the start of February. The reason I make these differentiations because of the methodology of SMM. SMM reports only self-corroborated incidents. That incidents that have been monitored and checked by itself are included in our report. So these allegations coming from the news or from the parties, we have to first go check, speak with the people, then we report. So there is a delay of time between the incident and our reportings. If I may continue with the first statement, the presence of mines and explosive remnants of ammunition continue to pose a grave threat to the lives of civilians. Their ability to visit family, cultivate their land, fish in lakes and rivers, go to work and school, and even visit cemeteries is severely curtailed by the presence of such objects. Let's be aware that even when kinetic activity stops, those deadly devices continue to kill or maim civilians undoubtedly. The sides must adhere to commitments made in March 2016 TCG decision on mine action to mark and fence off areas to be cleared of mines and to provide mine and UXO risk awareness training for civilians. The sides must also intensify their efforts with regard to mine action and demining. If this is not done, the threat these objects pose will regrettably persist for years and even decades to come, as we have seen in our continuing sadness in other contexts. Esteemed parliamentarians, the measures to strengthen the ceasefire that the sides agreed to last July ban the deployment of heavy weapons in and around settlements, primarily at civilian infrastructure, schools, kindergartens, hospitals, and public premises. However, the SMM continues to observe military and military-type personnel and equipment inside and close to residential areas on both sides of the line, which exposes the civilians living in those areas to additional risks. Regrettably, the sides are yet to respond to these facts regularly reported by SMM and take any remedial action. In 2020, the SMM corroborated damage to 131 civilian property and infrastructure sites, with additional reports of damage to 418 civilian objects pending confirmation. This includes houses, apartment buildings, schools, shops, as well as water, gas, and electricity infrastructure. 4 of these objects were damaged after additional measures to strengthen the ceasefire took effect. In 2021, the mission confirmed damage to 5 houses in non-government controlled Signalny, Donetsk region, and a functioning school in non-government controlled Zolote 5, Mikhailivka in Luhansk region. Since November 2020, the SMM has also received reports of damages to 41 civilian properties and infrastructure objects, which the mission is in the process of corroborating. While these numbers present an overall downward trend, they also demonstrate that more remains to be done by the sides. Critical civilian infrastructure installations, including those providing water and power for millions of people on both sides of the contact line, also continue to be damaged and at risk. The SMM deploys patrols to monitor localized ceasefires, the so-called windows of silence, for the operation, maintenance, and repair of these civilian structures. In 2020 alone, the SMM facilitated 1,600 windows of silence for repairs to critical infrastructure, providing water, electricity, gas, and communications to 6 million people. The number of window silence and the number of infrastructure sites has been increasing ever since 2017. So far, in 2021, the mission has facilitated and monitored localized ceasefires for the operation of and repair of maintenance to 25 sites, benefiting nearly 2 million civilians. It is essential that these sites are able to operate so that civilians continue to have access to needed services, particularly amid COVID-19 pandemic. However, barely a week goes by without our patrols recording ceasefire violations, for example, in the area of Donetsk filtration station, including during the periods of shifts or changes. This means that violations happen, although the parties who committed themselves to ceasefire recommitted themselves not to shoot in that specific area. In the presence of SMM patrols, the SMM will continue this critical work even while following the stringent COVID-19 prevention measures, but it also shows what needs to be done immediately, totally in that regard. Dear participants, an additional concern in 2020 has been the amplified difficulty civilians now face in crossing the contact line, which was already a difficult and dangerous undertaking before the pandemic. Currently, civilians can only use 2 crossing points along the contact line. As many of you know, there were 5. Restrictions at crossing points since March 2020 have led to a more than 90% drop in civilian crossings, according to the statistics of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine. In January in 2021, this trend continued and worsened. Now, the drop comparable to last year is 97.3%. When our patrols monitor the situation at crossing points, civilians continue to share how these restrictions impact their lives. For example, a woman in her 40s told one of our patrols last year that with the current situation, she was forced to choose between her mother in government-controlled Sloviansk and her father in non-government-controlled Donetsk. The reduction of crossing affects people-to-people contacts, which has potentially negative long-term effects on the conflict and prospects for its resolution. Almost 30% of the most vulnerable people in need of assistance in areas in eastern Ukraine affected by the conflict are elderly. In settlements close to the contact line, this percentage is high as 41%. The elderly are also less mobile. They depend on the ability to collect their pensions in government-controlled areas, something some have not been able to do for nearly a year now, with serious repercussions on the ability of many to sustain their living. In addition to direct harm from conflict, children also face limited access to education, among other consequences. In the past 7 years, many children in Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine have spent a significant portion of their childhood under constant threat of violence and insecurity due to the conflict. Dear parliamentarians, in conclusion, I would like to underline that political will and progress during negotiations are essential for maintaining an improved security situation and creating the conditions for further improvements in the humanitarian situation. From the SMM side, we will continue to work hand in hand with the chair and the secretariat, as well as with other executive structures and institutions, and of course, the Parliamentary Assembly, to contribute to tangible progress for the benefit of civilians on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chevik. Thank you to both of you for this very useful introduction, which I think has touched on both the policy and theoretical issues, as well as some of the very practical challenges of humanitarian support. I think this gives us a very good launching point for the discussion, which I'm very pleased we can do to make sure that this remains high on our agenda. I understand that we're joined today by the President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Lord Peter Bowness. So I was thinking that maybe you would like to start off our discussion today, Mr. Bowness, if you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and good afternoon, colleagues. And may I just begin by thanking our two speakers this afternoon, Mr. Mora, who has described the work of the International Committee of the Red Cross. I think we all believe that we're familiar with the work of the Red Cross, but it's very good to hear directly the work which is being done in areas of conflict, and also hearing from Ambassador Chevik regarding the Special Monitoring Mission. The Special Monitoring Mission was, in a way, one of the successes of OSCE, which, despite the problems of decision-making, was able to launch the mission. And I think it has been extraordinarily valuable to hear from Mr. Chevik of the work that it is doing in Ukraine. Whilst I mention Ukraine, colleagues, I just send our good wishes to our Ukrainian colleague, who I understand has had to leave because of a snow hurricane in Kiev. I'm actually appalled at the idea of a snow hurricane. A very small spot of snow in the UK causes great problems. What a hurricane would do to us, I can't imagine. However, good wishes and hope that she doesn't have a problem. I think it's very disturbing to realize that in 2021 there are people, men, women and children, trapped in or displaced by conflict within our region, and that the things that we hoped were going to be just the subject of old newsreels from the last century were in fact a question of history, but sadly they are not. And for that reason, the Parliamentary Assembly continues to pay considerable attention to the situation in Ukraine, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and indeed also Georgia and Moldova, where there are conflicts of perhaps lesser disturbance for individuals, but nevertheless, we have a situation where there are people trapped within those conflicts and within and on the wrong side of borders. So all these matters are always on our agenda. Most recently at our online winter meeting, and I pay tribute to you, Mr. Chairman, for the work of your committee and officers and members who constantly keep a watch on what is happening in the world and bringing to people's attention our concerns about human rights in those particular areas. We've all lived with COVID-19, and many of our dialogues have highlighted the problems which that has concerned, exacerbated the difficulties, particularly in conflict areas, and highlighted the conflict that inevitably there is between necessary measures which have been taken to fight the pandemic and the continuance of human rights. I think, Mr. Chair, that we are going to be, unfortunately, having to keep these matters on our agenda for a very long time. What I would like to say to both our speakers is that our support for the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Special Monitoring Mission is unfailing, and we will continue to press for national governments to take account of the needs of these bodies and to ensure that there's international support from our governments. The Special Monitoring Mission is already acting in an area which has considerable danger, and sadly lost one of the staff a number of months ago. So the fact that it's an unarmed mission monitoring, the name somewhat disguises the danger which people are working under. So our role is to keep these matters to the forefront. Where we can, we will try and institute dialogue between the warring parties. We will, of course, have dialogue within our own organization. The German delegation hosted a series of Landsweiler seminars aimed at bringing about this kind of dialogue to find ways of alleviating suffering by civilians on the ground. And of course, we haven't been able to have those in this last 12 months. However, it is the kind of work which the Parliamentary Assembly does and will, I'm sure, continue to do, and not least of all, and I fear that this is a message which I find myself having to give in almost every webinar or conference that we have. Our role as parliamentarians is to bring to the attention of our national governments these problems and the work which the OSCE and other organizations such as the Red Cross are doing. They don't get enough attention at the right level of government. I thank you so much for the floor, and I thank our chair and his committee and everyone for organizing this afternoon's seminar.
Thank you very much, President Bonas. With that, we will then continue. The first speaker on my list is Vice President Azerbaijani from Azerbaijan, to be followed by Ms. Ani Sansomyan from Armenia. We have some time, but I'm hoping not to set a specific time limit. Please do keep your remarks short, so that we make sure that everybody's able to speak. Vice President Guliev, please.
Thank you very much, dear Andres, dear Kyriakos, dear President, dear distinguished members of the Parliament. First of all, I'd like to extend my gratitude to our Assembly for organizing this web dialogue on the humanitarian protection and the human rights in conflict-affected areas. Today's event is the first such meeting dedicated to this specific issue after the ending of Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. As you know, this conflict was a true humanitarian shock and tragedy for the entire region, when thousands of people lost their lives and nearly 1 million of Azerbaijanis were expelled from their places of origin, being deprived of a natural right for secure and dignified life. In my view, this meeting or web dialogue is an excellent opportunity to sum up the events of the last several months in order to make clear for everyone the realities on the ground. For full understanding of the events which happened during the course of 44-day war, it is necessary to review the events preceding the deciding stage of Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. The negotiations between the two states came to a deadlock due to the unacceptable demands and military provocations started on September 27, 2020 by the political military leadership of Armenia. Azerbaijan had to respond to this provocation of Armenia with retaliatory and peace enforcement measures. The counter-offensive measures resulted in full liberation of Azerbaijani's territories which were occupied by Armenia. Azerbaijan had, in fact, single-handedly implemented the 4 resolutions of UN Security Council demanding full, completely withdrawal of Armenian military forces from the occupied areas. On November 10, 2020, the leaders of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Russian Federation signed a trilateral statement putting an end to the almost 3 decades long armed conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But unfortunately, during the course of the 44-day war, the armed forces of Armenia deliberately attacked the densely populated residential areas, thus committing serious war crimes, crimes against humanity, and state terror. Armenia particularly used the internationally prohibited cluster munitions, Scud missiles, and white phosphorus against the civilians in Ganja, Barda, and other major cities of Azerbaijan far away from the conflict zone. As a result of such indiscriminate attacks of Armenia, 101 Azerbaijani civilians were killed, 423 civilians were wounded. Dear colleagues, now let me brief you on the humanitarian measures undertaken by my country in accordance with the 10 November statement. First, the safe return of 50,000 Armenian refugees to Azerbaijan was ensured. Azerbaijan has created the necessary conditions for receiving of humanitarian aid by them. All the necessary communication means, including the railways and airports, were provided for this purpose. Within the frameworks of humanitarian measures, also enshrined in the 10 November statement, as of today, Azerbaijan has returned to Armenia 71 war prisoners and the bodies of almost 1,300 foreign Armenian servicemen. Now, I deem it necessary to inform you on the main tasks that Azerbaijan will undertake regarding further solution of humanitarian issues. First, the main challenges is that the mining of liberated territories. Please be informed that nearly 20 persons were killed and 70 heavily wounded as a result of mine explosions after the war ended. Unfortunately, Armenia still refuses to submit the map of landmines despite the demands of international humanitarian law, causing the deaths of innocent people. The second task is the rebuilding and restoration of these territories. Azerbaijan will have to rebuild a large area of more than 10,000 square kilometers completely ruined by Armenia. Azerbaijan has already started this process, and companies of several friendly countries have already decided to make the investments in the amount of more than 500 million USD. Azerbaijan also allocated nearly 2 billion USD for these purposes, aiming to realize the smart village, smart city, and the green energy concepts in these areas. For your information, during the occupation, more than 65 mosques were destroyed or used as pigsties by Armenia. Despite these devastating consequences, Azerbaijan is resolute to restore the destroyed religious and cultural objects, as well as preserve the historical and cultural objects and monuments, including the Christian churches. The third task is the return of former IDPs to conflict-affected areas. in accordance with the paragraph 10 of in paragraph 7 of the 10 November statement, after realization of the previous two tasks under the control of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The first task is the reintegration of Azerbaijan citizens of Armenian origin into Azerbaijani's political, social, economic space, providing them with the equal rights as other citizens under our constitution. The fifth task is the restoration of communications in accordance with 11 January 2021 trilateral statement and conclusion of comprehensive peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, based on mutual respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and inviolability of internationally recognized borders of all states. In light of the mentioned facts, I found it necessary to remind that the term Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and it is used in unacceptable. There is also no administrative territory called Nagorno-Karabakh in the Republic of Azerbaijan. We expect the OSCE Minsk Group and other international stakeholders to live in the past the obsolete terms and approaches and closely engage and support the implementation of the mentioned tasks. Any international stakeholder wishing to contribute to the present situation must direct all its activities to sustainable peace, stability, and cooperation in the South Caucasus. Armenia should also act responsibly, fulfill its obligations under the November trilateral statement, and put aside its revanchist attempts. Any revision or interference of the achievements of the November statement is not only harmful, but also dangerous. Dear colleagues, in conclusion, I think that the OSCE PA has a role to play in the reconciliation process between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Taking this opportunity, I would like to invite the OSCE PA's interested delegations to visit the liberated territories of the Republic of Azerbaijan and get acquainted with the real situation on the ground. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Guliev. I will then call on Annie Samsonyan from Armenia to be followed by Mr. Joe Wilson from the United States. Samsonyan, please.
Thank you, dear colleagues. I'm pleased to attend this meeting and discuss matters regarding humanitarian question. I think it is very important. And today I want to tell you about humanitarian questions and war crimes committed by Azerbaijani side during Nagorno-Karabakh war. Speaking about this, we must take into consideration following issues. One, mass attacks against peaceful population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Second, torture and inhuman treatment against Armenian prisoners of war, against captives and died Armenian servicemen. Third, deployment Syrian terrorists and jihadists to Nagorno-Karabakh using mercenary forces. And fourth, using forbidden weapons, including chemical weapons. Thus, during Nagorno-Karabakh war, many villages, towns, and the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh were being continuously targeted by the Azerbaijani armed forces. Armenian peaceful population, women, children, elderly persons was under attack and real threat. Villages of Vartanis region, even Gevarkunik province of Armenia, are under shelling from Azerbaijani side. Azerbaijani military is directly targeting schools and kindergartens, residential buildings, including Red Cross building in Stepanakert, other civilian infrastructures in Stepanakert and other towns, densely populated civilian capital city. Besides that, Azerbaijani drones permanently targeted peaceful population. Azerbaijan violated Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. Azerbaijani armed forces treated prisoners of war and dead bodies of Armenian soldiers in gross violation of international humanitarian law. They hit the heads of dead bodies. They post selfies with dead bodies on social networks, took photos holding the severed head of the Armenian soldiers. Under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, willful killings of persons protected under the provisions of the Geneva Convention constitutes a war crime. In one of such videos, Azerbaijani armed forces put the severed head of Armenian on a body of a dead animal, of a pig. Do you imagine, dear colleagues? They are mocking and insulting of the Armenian, saying that it is in their revenge. Azerbaijani internet sources have widely spread video how members of Azerbaijani armed forces captures Armenian elderly person, obviously a civilian, have been struck on the back cruelly. I can tell you about more videos and describe more scenes of inhuman treatment, which are all proved by videos and photos. Numerous video footage appeared on social network and were widely spread, showing torture, cruel and inhuman treatment of Armenian prisoners of wars by Azerbaijani side. What about mercenaries? Turkey deployed mercenaries from northern part of Syria to Azerbaijan to use them against Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, according to regularly reported information in international media. It's about 3,000, 4,000 mercenaries. You know, dear colleagues, the United Nations and OSCE regulations strongly condemn use of mercenaries to impede the exercise of the right of peoples to self-determination, considering mercenaries' activities crimes and threat to security, peace, and human rights. Azerbaijan shelled the city of Hadrut in Artsakh with 2 Smerch rockets. As a result of the shelling by cluster munition, the civilian population was harmed. The Geneva Convention and the UN Convention on Cluster Munition prohibiting the use of such dangerous weapons. International law prohibits the use of cluster munition, considering them lethal and inhuman. Azerbaijan also used ammunitions containing chemical elements. They are used towards forests, causing mass fires and destruction. And the forests where those ammunition were used are located near the civilian communities. It was a white phosphorus, which is not stopped even with the extinguishing materials or water. And for conclusion, I want to respond to Mr. Guliev. Mr. Guliev, you present yourself as a delegate of peace, but you can't escape of responsibility, I think. Or you forget how your country attacked Shushi Cathedral, Armenian church, and more civilians were died. You attacked this church without blink of an eye. They were women and children in the church at that moment. Dear colleagues, some photos and videos I sent to Mr. Hajiani during Nagorno-Karabakh war, and I think all these war crimes committed by Azerbaijan must be strongly condemned. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Samsonyan. I will now call on Mr. Joe Wilson from the United States, to be followed by Inka Hopsu from Finland, please. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Andreas, and our thoughts and prayers for our colleagues in Ukraine to face a snow hurricane. I just can't imagine. But I also want to send greetings from the southeastern part of the United States. It's springtime here. The weather's beautiful. And then it's also a reminder of our shared heritage. Throughout our region, we have beautiful gardens that the shrubs, the flowers, the designs are directly attributable to our shared heritage of OSCE countries. And so please visit. We'd love to have you come. You'll feel right at home. And fellow parliamentarians and presenters, when the Cold War ended in 1991, many Americans, including myself, wanted the Russian people to succeed. We are so appreciative of the Russian people for so many cultural treasures, like the composer Stravinsky and writer Tolstoy. I was grateful in 1994 to have hired the first Russian page as a student intern in the State Senate of South Carolina. I have toured the extraordinary cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. I've given lectures on democracy in Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, Tomsk, and Omsk. And I'm happy that Chelyabinsk is the sister city of my home community of Columbia, South Carolina. Russian Americans have established an incredible record of achievement in the United States. For Russia to be at peace with itself and the world, it needs leaders who reject the Soviet way of invading, occupying, and repressing their citizens and other countries. Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 and the illegal occupation of Moldova prove that Russia's leaders are still unworthy of the Russian people. The Kremlin remains committed to lashing out at its neighbors across its borders instead of promoting economic opportunity for its citizens at home. The Russian government continues to occupy and attempt to illegally annex Crimea. Illegal armed groups that created funds and commands controlled parts of the Donbass region with over 13,000 Ukrainians who have been killed. Under international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, the Kremlin is therefore responsible for religious freedom violations in these territories. Russian authorities and their thugs have kidnapped, detained, imprisoned, and tortured people peacefully practicing their faith. That is why I and my fellow Helsinki Commissioner, Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, have introduced bipartisan Democrat and Republican legislation to combat these assaults and hold Russian officials accountable. The Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act. It would authorize and require the President of the United States to consider the worst religious violations in Crimea and the Donbass, as long as the Kremlin controls those territories when determining whether to designate Russia as a country of particular concern, not just violations in Russia. The Russian government is willfully violating the OSCE commitments on freedom of religion or belief. I encourage parliamentarians and governments and other participating states to repel and prevent these brutal attacks on the people of faith in Crimea and Donbass. Thank you, everyone, for your efforts for OSCE success. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I will now call on Ms. Inka Hopsu from Finland to be followed by Mr. Marius Andrei Miftode from Romania, please. Ms. Hopsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and honorable speakers, dear colleagues, snowy wishes also from Finland. I think we are discussing a very important topic. The pandemic has dominated the agenda for more than a year, but the conflict situation in the OSCE region and elsewhere persists. The events in Nagorno-Karabakh last September clearly showed how quickly a situation can escalate into a warlike situation and circumstances. The hostilities have since calmed down, but having followed the discussion with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, it has become clear that much still needs to be done to appease the feelings of injustice and hurt. I would therefore like to highlight the importance of reconciliation. Dialogue is always better than weapons, and the only way to understand the other side is to open up and listen. No conflict situation is free from human rights violations, and they will most likely happen on both sides. However, to move forward and achieve lasting peace, both parties must own up to what has happened and find way out. Conflicts are often complex matters with long roots reflecting different events in history, changing political constellations, and severe human tragedies. Building peace and sustainable development in such circumstances requires new approaches. In its recent report, the Finnish Development Committee refers to the triple nexus, which seeks to highlight the interlinkages between humanitarian aid, development, and peace actors and the work. Rather than focusing purely on conflict prevention, it aims to build on meaningful civil society participation and building cooperative actions that will have positive impact on society in the long run and lead to the peace. I am also currently preparing a report in the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly on the role of young people in conflict resolution. During my work, I have learned that involving all members of society in peace processes will create a better chance of success. Ultimately, it could lead to a better understanding that will help prevent the escalation of the tensions in the future. Learning the process of reconciliation starts at early age, and as a teacher, I encourage to include mediation skills and human rights education into the school curricula. This way, future generations are better equipped to prevent and handle possible escalations of conflicts and their aftermath in a more balanced way. To conclude, I would like to encourage all participating states to implement UN Security Council resolutions 1325 and 2250. The first one is Women, Peace and Security, and the second one is Youth, Peace and Security. They provide us with many necessary tools to inclusive peace mediation, conflict resolution, and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hopsu. I will now ask Mr. Marius Miftore from Romania to be followed by Maka Pochorishvili from Georgia. Mr. Miftore, please.
Hello, dear colleagues. As a very new member of the Assembly, allow me to make a few brief remarks related to the first points suggested for consideration within the concept note of this timely webinar. We refer to the protracted conflicts in the Black Sea region. The heavy militarization of the affected areas could be seen as detrimental to the situation of the population. We witness a process of illegal borderization with serious negative effects for the movement of population and provision of humanitarian assistance. Therefore, we should act together on multiple directions to substantially address the situation. Obviously, the most important way is to ensure the peaceful resolution of the conflict through the means of political negotiations and to restore the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. Romania commends and supports OSCE in its mediation activities. Secondly, the OSCE activity on the ground should be supported by all states. Romania condemns and the obstacles that hinder the activity of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and calls on all responsible parties to ensure the fulfillment of the mission's mandate. Thirdly, the international community should support the economic rehabilitation of the affected areas. At the same time, Romania draws attention to the negative consequences of the illegal annexation of Crimea, affecting the economy of the Ukrainian regions adjacent to the Black Sea. Fourthly, improving the humanitarian situation of the affected population is a necessity. Last year, Romania offered a donation of 150,000 euros on the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs for its activity in Eastern Ukraine. As a parliamentarian, I fully appreciate OSCE's activity, and I will try to ensure the necessary political support for it. I thank you all for your efforts in promoting peace and stability in the Northern Hemisphere, and especially in the Black Sea region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to Ms. Maka Pochorishvili from Georgia to be followed by Ms. Kari Henriksen from Norway. Please, Ms. Pochorishvili.
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, to organizers of this important discussion on developments in conflict zones and the ways of improving human rights conditions of the conflict-affected population. For the past decades, ongoing conflicts and numerous crises have been mirroring stability and security in the OSCE area. While public attention has been focused on fighting against common invisible enemy and on the impact caused by the COVID pandemic, we should not forget our visible challenges that in conflict zones in different parts of the OSCE region. We continue to witness grave violations of human rights and the fundamental norms and principles of international law in Georgia's occupied regions. Amid the pandemic, when all else on the international agenda has been moved to the secondary position, the Russian Federation continues occupation and factual annexation of Georgian regions, Abkhazia and Tkhinvali, South Ossetia, undermining international law and rule-based international order. The scale of Russia's growing provocative actions and hybrid warfare tools against Georgia have been mounting and has been translated into a more fragile security and humanitarian situation on the ground. Georgia has also been hit by Russia's intensified hybrid warfare through disinformation and large-scale cyber attacks, including aggressive media propaganda against the Lugar Center for Health Research, which remains a vital infrastructure in the fight against COVID-19 in Georgia, turned into a main target of Moscow disinformation campaign. Moreover, continuous installation of barbed wire fences and other artificial obstacles along the occupation line and adjacent areas, as well as unprecedentedly lengthy closure of the so-called crossing points and restriction of freedom of movement, including denial of medical evacuation that often leads to fatal cases, have extremely aggravated the humanitarian situation. Such destructive actions of the occupying powers continue to prevent the efforts of Georgian authorities to assist the citizens living on the other side of occupation line during the COVID-19. Unfortunately, there is no international humanitarian law applied in Georgia's occupied regions. Russia has blocked humanitarian and international access, worsening the human rights and security situation on the ground with the fundamental rights and right of the local population infringed on a daily basis. Russia further ignores the humanitarian and human rights repercussions of its illegal actions, and consequently actual lives continue to be lost. Recent outrageous decision of Russia's backed Tkhinvali authorities to sentence illegally detained Georgian citizen Zaza Gacheladze for more than 12 years under the Russian Criminal Code is a clear example of how the occupation forces manipulate with people's life. Georgia urges Russian Federation to ensure immediate release of Zaza Gacheladze and all other illegally detained Georgian citizens, but despite repeated calls, nothing has been done, which has fueled the sense of impunity and led to further cases of torture and deprivation of lives. Here I want to also echo the European Court of Human Rights recent judgment, which unequivocally confirms Russia's occupation, effective control over the Georgian indivisible regions, Russia's full responsibility for human rights violations during the August 2008 Russia-Georgia war, as well as the subsequent period of occupation, and the denied access of international human rights mechanisms on the ground. Russia's invasion of Georgia's occupation of 20% of territories is a clear demonstration of Moscow's action to unilaterally redraw European borders by force. continuous military buildup seriously undermines security, peace in wider Europe and requires serious engagement from the international community. We have to stand not only for Georgia, but to defend our common principles, values, and interests. Russia must reverse its steps towards annexation of Georgia's region, cease violation of human rights on the territories, and provide free access for humanitarian assistance to each of these two regions, respect Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and fulfill its international obligations, inter alia EU-mediated 12 August 2008 ceasefire agreement. The EUMM is the only international monitoring mechanism in Georgia, ensuring with an important task of providing the international community with reliable and objective information on the security and human rights situation, as well as on the violations of Russia-Georgia ceasefire agreement by Russia. For the moment, for more than 12 years, the UMM has played an essential role in preventing the escalation of the conflict, contributing to enhancing security and stability on the ground. However, monitors those mandates extend throughout the entire territory of Georgia have no access to the occupied region. In conclusion, peaceful conflict resolution is of highest importance for all of us and regional stability, as Georgia shares the goal of preserving peace around the world. We are ready to join international community's efforts to build back better from the pandemic and strengthen the promotion of protection of human rights across the OSCE area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Ms. Kari Henriksson, Vice President of the OSCE PA, to be followed by Ms. Grigoryan from Armenia. Ms. Henriksson, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Mura, and also Ambassador Chevik, for your remarks. You are drawing a very realistic picture and give us understanding on the people's situation on the ground. And I just want to share some experiences, because you said it was, both of you was pointing at the parliamentarians' responsibility to raise questions in their own parliaments and to their own governments. And I would just share with you some experience that I have done, because I have raised these questions in such questions as humanitarian dimensions, for instance, collaboration within the OSCE and other international organizations in my own parliament. And my experience is that it is a very good way of raising awareness of the situation in the national parliaments. So I would just like to encourage all of us which are listening to this debate to do that kind of thing, and also be brave enough to be critical to our own governments, because we have a common commitment to make sure that the OSCE's goals and commitments are fulfilled. That is our main goal. So I just want to encourage all of us to do more of that kind of actions. And then I would also like to raise two issues to the discussion. The one issue is the gender perspective. The women, and especially also children, are most vulnerable in conflict situations. And I'm very glad that the new director of the OSCE, Helga Schmid, has stated and really put forward the need for women in conflict solutions. So I also, if you are going to have any remarks at the end, I would like to have your experiences. How is the situation regarding women's participation in conflict solutions? And are there any work, especially related to make more women active in these kinds of solutions. The other issue I just also want to raise is the issue of education. I don't think any of you raised this kind of that matter, but I am concerned about the youngsters and the youth in conflict zones and their possibilities to have good education and the right education. So I just want to put these themes at the agenda, and I'm very pleased if any of you wants to comment on it, because I think that is also two issues that is very important, both in solutions but also in understanding the consequences in the conflict areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Henriksson. Now I'll pass the floor to Ms. Grigorian from Armenia, to be followed by Ms. Sederfeld from Sweden. Ms. Grigorian, please.
Thank you very much. Dear Secretariat and honorable guests, greetings from Yerevan. I want to start with thanking the organizers for putting together this event and addressing these very important issues, the humanitarian protection and the human rights in conflict zones. Expressing my gratitude to the speakers, I want to separate the words of Mr. Hajiani, who spoke about the need to properly investigate all the war crimes in the conflict zones. And I say this for the following reason. I will be organizing my thoughts in several topics, but I want to begin with the very fact of the start of the 44-day war in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was unleashed by Azerbaijan against Nagorno-Karabakh and its people. And it has been done in a total violation of international humanitarian law amid the COVID-19 pandemic. A war took lives of several thousands of people on both sides. However, the war did not start. It wasn't started by both sides. It never starts by both sides. In fact, it was a very well-planned aggression by Azerbaijan, accompanied with very high-level Azerbaijani political actors who spoke about the very intentions of this aggression, being cleansing of the Armenian population from their homeland and aiming at resolving the conflict through use of force. Now, my colleagues from Azerbaijan, speaking about the conflict, mention the end of the conflict, speak about the conflict as if it has ended. What I want to say is that if we simply hear to that and do not respond, then do we allow the thought that the conflict can be resolved not peacefully, but through the use of force? Is this anyhow acceptable for us as member states of the OSCE? War crimes, including executions, inhumane and degrading treatment of prisoners of war and civilian captives, beheadings, mutilation of dead bodies, and other crimes are well documented. As we have heard of multiple international actors and institutions condemning the war and aggression, the voices of targeted assessment and calls to stop the war needed to be heard much louder. We are speaking about the need to address the humanitarian issues, and we need not to do so in order to only alleviate the pain of those who have undergone the sufferings of war, but for another and a very important reason, to prevent them from happening again, to prevent their repetition. It here becomes a much more global issue than of the very concrete people affected. Against this backdrop, I'm emphasizing once again the importance of targeted and objective calls and formulations when addressing the war and its particular situations. It is essential to keep the chronology of the events and to timely respond to the war crimes that occur, the flagrant violations of humanitarian laws with a very specific goal of preventing them from reoccurring. We're now speaking about the need to create an atmosphere of confidence and trust. And Mr. Guliev from Azerbaijani delegation was speaking about creating this possibility for mutual trust and confidence and respect. So I want to show something, and I don't know if it's well seen on your screens. Can you see this? This is a post stamp which was produced last year, at the end of the last year in Azerbaijan. What it depicts is a specialist, disinfecting specialist on the map of Azerbaijan on this side, and this is the land of Nagorno-Karabakh. And the specialist is disinfecting, spraying the areas where Armenians live. Have you heard of any criticism and condemnation of producing anything like this? And is it even possible to speak about an atmosphere of mutual trust or about the possibility of building this trust? Also, I cannot bypass the issue, which is a very essential right during these days, the issue of the prisoners of war and captives. Again, our Azerbaijani colleagues are speaking and providing numbers of the returned captives. We know that there are tens of more captives, and it is not acceptable to politicize this very humanitarian issue. We are here to speak about not only the events, not only the phenomena, and condemn or criticize them in general, because we're never going to prevent specific crimes from happening if we do not address them directly. It is our obligation to speak very directly, to go through investigations in order to prevent. This doesn't only refer to Armenia, to Armenians, to many other nations who have same issues here. We need to speak directly. We need to tell the truth. We need to keep to the values and follow the values that we every time claim to be ours in order to truly respect them. And I rely here on all of you and all the member states of the OSCE and our international community. Thank you very much.
Which is good.
Thank you very much. I will now be giving the floor to Vice President Sederfeld, followed by Mr. Ganjalia from Azerbaijan. I would just note that we have 30 minutes left, so I'm going to ask everybody to please keep your remarks short so we can make sure that everybody has an opportunity. With that, Ms. Sederfeld, please.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. And thank you, Mr. President, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for giving me the floor. And I would also like to say thank you to our Secretariat for arranging this kind of meetings during the COVID-19, that we could continue with our work in our OSCE PA and meet, even if it's not in person, because I think we need more of multilateralism these days. And also thank you, Kyriakos, dear colleague, who have initiated this meeting. It's very important. And yes, when it's war, it's difficult times for everybody, particularly for those who suffer. And it was, I must say that both Mr. Moros and Mr. Halit Chevik's presentation was very welcome. And I do on regular basis read the SMM report from Ukraine and the Donetsk-Luhansk region. And it shows the importance about awareness to be there and notice and document what's happened. And I do really wish this kind of missions could be on more places where there are conflict zones, because I think it's so important with this kind of fact, because it illustrates what goes on, and it gives also the input for us who don't live in the conflict zone to support and do what we can. Unfortunately, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it has gone on for 7 years now, 7 long years, it means that there are people who are born during the war who don't know anything else. Young people who have grown up who don't remember anything else. Elderly people who suffer, don't get medical care. And this is particular. I mentioned this because we live under the COVID. And there is another issue that I think it's important to raise. When we are making the vaccine campaign all over the world, what will happen with those people who live in the conflict zones? Will they also be provided vaccine? I think this is one of the very important issues these days to keep in mind. Another issue that I have noticed is very, very common is the rise of disinformation and fake news. And it's really make destabilization when people don't know who to trust, who to not trust, what is true, what haven't happened. And I have no solution on it, but I think that this is another really important issue to scrutinize, as today internet is there, the media is there, but what is the truth? I would also just like to mention, as we are talking about conflicts, that in OSCE PA we have the Ad Hoc Migration Committee, and I have noticed that several of my colleagues from the committee attend this meeting, and I think that's mostly welcome, because for those of you who don't know exactly what we do, please read our reports from the Ad Hoc group on migration. We produce them and present them every winter meeting, and we have supplementary items for the summer meeting. And those reports, they give an overview, thematic overview of the situation on migration in the OSCE area, and also have suggestions of best practice. And I mention this because migration is very closely related to conflict zones. Thank you very much, Mr. Baker.
Thank you. I will now pass the floor to Mr. Gençaliev from Azerbaijan, to be followed by Mr. Aydin from Turkey. Mr. Gençaliev, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Dear colleagues, it's my great privilege and honor to be among the participants of this very interesting webinar today. And frankly speaking, every time before joining this kind of very interesting webinars organized by the OSCE PA, I always expect and hope to hear some constructive words from my Armenian colleagues. But every time my expectations get failed, because unfortunately today, listening to my Armenian colleagues one more time, demonstrating that they are still thinking in past terms, talking about the current situation in the South Caucasus, which is very important in terms of security, economic dimensions, and human dimensions of the OSCE region. Of course, as a person who was born in Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, and I spent my many years as a child in Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, I understand all the difficulties of people who suffered from the conflict, but unfortunately, the conflict which started 30 years ago with the invasion of armed forces of Armenia against Azerbaijan, and I have witnessed this conflict on my own skin, on my own experience. Because when I was 12 years old, as a child living in Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, I was expelled from my home. I was born in Khankandi and I was raised in the city of Shusha. And when I was 12, I was expelled from my home. It was a kind of very interesting twist of fate that after 30 years, finally, when the conflict is over, and as a member of parliament from Azerbaijan, representing the constituency of the city of Khankandi, and as a member of Azerbaijan in the OSCE PA delegation, of course, I am looking very much forward to return back to Nagorno-Karabakh region as soon as the security situation allows. And I would like to say that as a person, with my family in Nagorno-Karabakh region, with those 1 million Azerbaijanis, we had very wonderful time before Armenian occupation started. We had many Armenian friends, we had many Armenian neighbors, we were living together. But when these nationalistic-minded people from Yerevan started calling Armenians living together with Azerbaijanis in Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan to fight against Azerbaijan, it was the end of story. It was the end of our peaceful cohabitation, because the Armenians who lived in Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan and who live right now, they are citizens of Azerbaijan, and we accept them. We assume them as the citizens of Azerbaijan. And what now we are thinking about to reintegrate all Armenian citizens to economic, to political sphere, space of Azerbaijan, and to end all the problems that was created by the government of Armenia. By the way, I would like to invite my Armenian colleagues to listen very carefully and attentively to the words of Armenia's Deputy Culture Minister, Ms. Zhanna Andreasyan. I was watching her interview a few days ago, and she warned about the danger of Nazi accomplice Garegen Nijdes ultra-nationalist ideology, which was planted in Armenian mind. And she warned again that it was Nijde ideology, this ultra-nationalist ideology propelled in Armenia that fueled this ethnic hatred, started this war. And of course, it is very important to have these constructive people from Armenia, as the Deputy Minister of Culture, Ms. Zhanna Andreasyan, understanding the situation from where it is coming from. So as a person, again, who was born, who spent 12 years as a child in Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, again, my as a member of parliament, my first job, my first wish is to see peaceful cohabitation of citizens of Azerbaijan, Armenians and Azerbaijanis in Karabakh region. And of course, I would like to also invite my Armenian colleagues to take some trainings in international law, international humanitarian law, look at the world map. When we were accepted as a United Nations member states, the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan has always been integral part of Azerbaijan. So by just saying unjustified, groundless, baseless claims against Azerbaijan, even after the conflict is over, is leading nowhere. So now, again, a security dimension is very important, but without economic dimension, it is not complete. Now, Azerbaijan is proposing a new platform for cooperation, economic platform. We are thinking about the connecting East with the Western countries, with Europe, one belt, one road, China's road, connecting Europe, East and West, North and South network, road and railway connection, connecting Russia with Indian Ocean. Azerbaijan is proposing this platform, and of course, Armenia must be involved and leave away all these accusations in order to be a part of this very important projects, energy projects looking into future. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you for your attention, and I would like to invite all my colleagues to look into the future to see a prosperous future of the South Caucasus, including all nations living there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned, we're getting short on time, so I'm going to ask everybody, I'm going to start reminding in 3 minutes and ask you to please keep your remarks within 3 minutes, because of course I also want to give an opportunity for our guest speakers to respond to anything they've heard in the debate. So the floor now goes to Mr. Aydin from Turkey, to be followed by Ms. Hedy Fry from Canada. Please, Mr. Aydin.
Yes. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody else. And now I would like to salute you all from Ankara, the capital city of Turkey. Dear Chairperson, dear colleagues, I would like to express my appreciation for this valuable web dialogue, which work to address conflicts, to focus attention on the human rights, fundamental freedoms, and humanitarian challenges of people in conflict areas and occupied territories and people affected by these conflicts. Crises in the OSCE region continue to pose a threat to human rights and security, despite the fact that our main goal is to prevent new conflicts, of course. And we would like to continue to emerge into today's extremely fragile environment. Therefore, it should be priority for all of us to resolve the emerging conflicts on the basis of lasting peace and stability. Unfortunately, 7 years after the beginning of the crisis, the situation remains tense in Donbass and Crimea. We are concerned about the ongoing political trials, unlawful detentions and interrogations carried out against Crimean Tatars in the peninsula. We hope Ukraine's new initiative Crimean Platform will provide an effective mechanism to discuss all issues related to annexation of Crimea. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that has resulted in casualties on an ongoing basis, such as since the early 1990s, again erupted into full-scale hostilities in the late September 2020, with fighting raging for some 6 weeks. After 30 years, we all saw how Azerbaijani towns in Kelbecher, Lachin, and other territories were razed to the ground during the occupation of Armenia. Religious and cultural sites, museums, monuments were not exempt from the ferocity. And now, I don't want to carry on with this because my Azerbaijani colleagues have already mentioned, but I would like to remind one last point. As the politicians, as the parliamentarians, honestly, we should be very careful about our rhetorics, because from Aristotle onwards, when we talk about the basic principles of rhetoric, honestly, I think it should be based on very healthy ground, which is logos, which is the information, the actual proved information. For example, as a parliamentarian, I would like to give one concrete example in order to draw your attention. Of course, Turkey, especially by my Armenian friend, Ani, talked about, this is the second time, I think, in the previous meeting as well. She tries to associate terrorism with Turkey. Yes, ironically, we can be associated with terrorism, but as a victim, because Turkey has paid a great price for terrorism. We have been suffering for more than 40 years. And giving a concrete example,
please conclude.
Yes, giving a concrete example, a couple of weeks ago, 13 innocent Turkish civilians were assassinated, were slaughtered by the terrorist organization PKK. And the Antony Blinken today has declared a notice to the world media saying that he was disappointed by the release of the Armenian terrorists from Los Angeles prison. Why? Because it was the decision taken by the Regional Higher Court of Los Angeles. And it was unacceptable and disappointing even to the American Foreign Affairs Minister. So we would like to speak honestly, basing on the actual supported, healthy sort of information. And from now on, I think we should better to discuss in order to reach, honestly, a real solution. Otherwise, in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we can keep trying for more than another 30 years. Thank you. Good evening to everybody else.
Thank you, Mr. Aydin. I now give the floor to Dr. Hedy Fry from Canada, to be followed by Nicholas Samkaradze from Georgia, please. Dr. Fry.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And, I want to thank the OSCE PA for having all of these conversations so often along webinars. I don't think we have talked to each other as much since COVID has allowed us to do everything virtually rather than in person than ever. We are talking to each other regularly, but are we listening to each other? This is my question. The actual issue we're discussing here is are two things: human rights violations and humanitarian efforts. Whenever we speak to human rights violations, we hear the same things over and over. He said, she said, no, I didn't. I have a reason for doing this. This is why this should continue. And this never resolves a problem. I would like us to find that during COVID, we have talked a lot. We have found common ground. We are able to see how we came together to deal with the virus, with all of the health regulations, with all of the vaccines, etc. Can we not now take that and translate it into working together on dealing with this human rights violations and creating a humanitarian effort? I would like us just to decide, to make a decision, like-minded countries in the region, to come together and say, look, enough is enough. There are people and countries and nation states that have been violating human rights with impunity. Let us put some impunity in here. Let's talk about sanctions. Let's talk about how all of us come together, forming a strong body, nation states, to decide on sanctions and whatever we need to do to stop it. So that's all I have to say about human rights violations. The second piece now is humanitarian efforts. I mean, we've seen COVID has exposed what is happening to the vulnerable in our region. We have seen how women are at that most vulnerable end of the stick. We're hearing in Ukraine, seniors are at the vulnerable end of the stick. We are hearing about children being at this vulnerable end of the stick. What are we going to do about it? I think we need to have a plan. All of us, again, coming together as like-minded countries with a multilateral effort and say, look, let's plan. Let's collect the data. Let's get that information. Let us make sure that we come together with a plan that includes legislation, programs, and policies. Let's stop closing borders. Let's work on a clear refugee and humanitarian effort to be able to help children and women and all these people that are displaced, wandering around the region with nowhere to go, stateless. Children who are going to grow up with a whole generation of children with no education, no knowledge. They're going to be the workers of the next generation. What are they going to bring to the table? Nothing. They would have been a lost generation. All of the children that are trafficked and the women that are trafficked. What are we going to do about it? We can't keep talking about it. We need to set some clear goals, measurable goals. Work together, those of us who believe we can, get our parliaments to agree that we are going to increase the humanitarian funding for efforts that we're doing, to set legislation, to get policies, and to be able to work at measurable goals, to moving forward, to getting real measurable results. Let us not keep talking.
Thank you. Please conclude.
We talk too much. We don't do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. Now I call on Mr. Samkaradze from Georgia to be followed by Ms. Agayeva from Azerbaijan, please. Mr. Samkaradze.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. As we speak about the human rights violations in the conflict regions and all over the OSCE area, I wanted to draw your attention to the most cruel violations of human rights, of the children's rights. Unfortunately, we've been witnessing for the last 13 years that ethnic Georgians who are living on occupied territories, children, I mean, I'm speaking about 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old children, are deprived of primary education in their native language. And since these children do not speak any other language, that means that they are deprived of the right of primary education. Unfortunately, for the last 13 years, we have not moved an inch forward in solving this problem. And this is I think these people are desperate in those regions, and they see that neither the Georgian government nor the international community can help them to have this basic right upheld. The second, also very cruel violation of human rights is eradication of Georgian track or Georgian trace in the occupied regions. This is destruction of churches, repainting of centuries-old frescoes, burning down the houses of ethnic Georgians so they never return to their homes. And this is happening in front of our eyes, and this is happening in front of the eyes of the international community. OSCE, as one of the co-chairs of Geneva discussion for the last 13 years, has, let's say openly and frankly, failed to bring any progress in negotiations. So here I would like to echo the previous speaker from Canada. Yes, we talk much, but we don't have any enforcement mechanisms and tools. And this is very unfortunate because in the current situation, when people need help, when they need assistance to solve the real problems that they are facing, unfortunately, the international society is unable to support them. So I think when we speak about challenges and when we speak about humanitarian efforts, this should be the priority to really help the people in need in those areas. First of all, by leaving aside all the political disagreements and interstate conflicts. But first and foremost, we need to take care of children to go to schools and have the right to get primary basic education in their native language, and in order to preserve the cultural heritage on those lands. So this is my call upon you to take this into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will then continue. We've got 3 more speakers on the list. So I'll give the word first to Ms. Agayeva from Azerbaijan, to be followed by Vice President Guliev, also from Azerbaijan. And then the final speaker will be Ms. Maria Karapetyan from Armenia. Please, Ms. Agayeva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, I'm greeting all the participants of the meeting. The topic we are discussing today is very important and I would say even sensitive. Considering that I've got only a few minutes, I'd like directly to touch upon 2 important issues of concern to Azerbaijan. The first one is Armenia's refusal to submit the maps of mined areas in the recently liberated territories to the Azov genocide as stipulated under the international humanitarian law. This is an important measure envisaged in the international humanitarian law to save human lives and accelerate post-conflict rehabilitation and reconstruction processes. I have to mention that in the result of this military and the civilians are losing their lives in those areas. Obtaining that map will prevent the loss of innocent people, and of course the resolution of this issue is one of the steps to regaining peace and security in the region. The second issue that worries us most is Azerbaijani citizens who are missing due to the occupation of Azerbaijani lands by Armenian armed forces. The whereabouts of 3,890 Azerbaijani citizens went missing due to the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 1992 and 1994. During this period need to be clarified in accordance with international humanitarian law. In view of the trilateral statement and cessation of all military activities, it's one of the most urgent issues to be solved with a view to healing the wounds of the families. And I call the international community to exert pressure on Armenia to cooperate on this important matter. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I then pass the floor to Vice President Guliev again, to be followed by Ms. Karapetyan. Ms. Guliev, please.
Thank you, dear Andres. Again, I am very grateful for your initiative, for the initiative put forward by Roberto and also Hajiani. Of course, this type of dialogue is very much important, and I really appreciate that. But I'm afraid that we have missed yet another opportunity to build a dialogue between countries, particularly if you look at my speech or listen to my speech. I particularly touched upon the necessity of rebuilding the bridges between Armenia and Azerbaijan, having the confidence building measures. But unfortunately, I didn't get any positive response from Armenian delegation. Maybe Armenian delegation needs some time in order to be ready for such constructive dialogue. I do wish that the time will come when Armenian colleagues will really respond adequately to what have been suggested by Azerbaijan. I raised this issue, Andres, once I asked my Armenian colleague to answer to one simple question, what they really look forward to see or to live in eternal peace or in eternal war or conflict. Because the 30 years conflict has showed that there is no political perspective to, let's say, launch attacks or aggression against your neighbors. But now the time has come to reopen new page in our history. The two statements, two documents signed by Azerbaijani leader and the Prime Minister of Armenia and the President of Russian Federation gives us new opportunity. I am really interesting to ask to know the position of Armenian delegation that your Prime Minister has put his signature on to these documents in order to put hostility to an end and to start talking about the possible cooperation. I do believe that Andres, our assembly can do also many efforts in that regard and to bring the sides together for the constructive discussions, for the constructive dialogue, because my personal conviction is that we shouldn't live in such a hostility, in hatred, because it doesn't bring any result or doesn't bring any benefit to either side. This is why I do hope that that my Armenian colleague at least will stop making propaganda aimed at blackmailing my country, because no groundless accusations is helpful neither Armenia or the region, because the region needs really reconciliation, peace, and security. Thank you, Mr. Andres.
Thank you, Mr. Guliev. And then our final speaker, Ms. Karapetyan from Armenia. I know we're going to be getting into borrowed time. I hope we can stay just a couple more minutes so that our guest speakers can also respond to anything they've heard in the debate, please. Ms. Karapetyan, please.
Thank you. I'll try to be very quick, Andreas. Dear colleagues, it's following the fall war. You probably can't imagine the amount of anxiety I feel when I join OSCE PA meetings, because I constantly think about what can I say in order to help facilitate the return of the Armenian detainees in Azerbaijan. Again, I want to call you all to make statements, to write letters, to work with your foreign ministers, to ensure that the dozens of Armenians who are still in the prisons of Baku have a chance to come back home, and the second Nagorno-Karabakh war will come to an end for these families as well, because the war hasn't ended for them. And it was a war. It wasn't skirmishes, it wasn't escalation, it was a full-scale war where the entire territory of Nagorno-Karabakh was bombarded, not just the line of contact. The entire militaries came into contact with each other. Our Azerbaijani colleagues wonder why we're not constructive. You can make a concrete step to hope for constructiveness from the Armenian side. It is the return of the Armenian hostages and detainees that you keep in Baku. Go back to your government and ask them to release them immediately and stop tagging them as terrorists. They are Armenian nationals that need to return home. You speak about integrating the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh into Azerbaijan. How much belief can there be in this if you keep Armenians hostage in Baku? Let them return home. You slap the international community in the face when you say you implemented UN Security Council resolutions through war. Nobody implements UN Security Council resolutions through war. You say you ensured the return of 50,000 Armenians to Nagorno-Karabakh. You don't have control over the movement of these Armenians. They returned to Nagorno-Karabakh because of the Russian peacekeepers. And it wasn't 50,000, it was 90,000 Armenians that moved from Nagorno-Karabakh to the Republic of Armenia, and following the end of the war, were able to return to their homes, if their homes actually existed. And finally, Mr. Guliev, you say Azerbaijan does not have an administrative unit called Nagorno-Karabakh. So basically, you're saying there is no Nagorno-Karabakh anymore for Azerbaijan. That's why the conflict is resolved. How can you hope for a constructive dialogue when this is your particular stance? And Mr. Tural Ganjaliev, please don't manipulate the words of the Armenian Vice Minister of Culture. Yes, we're a democracy, and a decade ago, within her academic freedom, the Vice Minister of Culture spoke self-critically about political discourses in Armenia. I wonder whether that is possible in Azerbaijan. No, it's not possible, because what Aliyev says, he says we will chase Armenians like dogs out of Nagorno-Karabakh. So that is the discourse that you have in Azerbaijan, and you need to stop it before hoping for constructive dialogue. I'm sorry, I apologize, colleagues, for this sort of language, but it's just enough is enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That concludes our discussion now, and we're actually exactly on time, but I hope that you can share just a few additional minutes. I would like to give, of course, our two expert speakers an opportunity to respond to anything that they heard or that was asked. I know there was one question particularly related to the way of promoting women's participation in conflict resolution, humanitarian affairs, and related to education. So I ask first, President Maurer, if you'd like to respond to anything that you've heard.
Thank you very much, and thanks for allowing us to follow the debate. I have 6 very small and short comments. First, I wanted to underline, it has been mentioned in the debate, of the importance of exchanging the most accurate possible information at the present moment and as we speak with regard to minefields and unexploded ordinances. This is absolutely critical in a Nagorno-Karabakh context in order to advance. Secondly, I wanted to highlight the positive interaction that the Icrc has with all sides in the Nagorno-Karabakh issue with regard to detainees. We have visited detainees on both sides, and I think this is a good step forward that we were able to do over the last couple of weeks, and I wanted to highlight positive elements in the relationship which has allowed us to move forward in the right direction, even if we are not yet where we should be and where we would like to be. Thirdly, I wanted to highlight the importance of the issue of disinformation, fake news, and so on. And I wanted to refer to a process that we have just started at the Icrc, convening a global advisory board on the protection of civilians from digital threats. I think that's a forward-looking and highly important issue. We know it for a long time that as such, misinformation and disinformation is a critical issue in war. It is a trust-building issue, but we have a new quality of problems that are coming towards us. And I hope that in a later debate, Icrc can eventually inform a more evidence-based discussion with proposal that we can bring forward. Fourthly, I wanted to highlight the issue of vaccines in conflict and equitable access to vaccination in conflict, maybe just to with one twist. We, in the OSCE space, and very often when we look at these issues, we tend to look at vaccines only as COVID being equitably accessible. Our experience in most of the conflict regions of the world is that today routine vaccination is as much a challenge as accessible, equitable access of COVID vaccines. And I wanted to highlight that this is a broader debate in the OSCE space as well as beyond. Fifthly, I wanted really to highlight the access to education as one of the issues which today is as important to the Icrc as is the protection of hospitals and medical workers and ambulances. I think today we do recognize that in humanitarian work, it is of strategic importance to have safe schools and to get back schools safely, kids back to school safely. And finally, let me indeed emphasize what Kari Henriksen has highlighted with regard to the gender perspective on conflict. We do know that conflict and crises exacerbate gender inequalities. And therefore, whether we look at gender issues from a victim's perspective or for the potential of helping us transport further on humanitarian principles and action, both are important and critical to Icrc's work. On the victim side, victims of sexual violence, mental health and psychosocial support programs are integrated part of all our programs in the OSCE space and beyond. If we look at the potential side, I just wanted to highlight that Icrc has specific training programs for frontline women negotiators, which are an important complement. Traditionally, always frontline negotiators in humanitarian action have been preponderantly men. We are training and bringing to the field women frontline negotiators because we are deeply convinced that only diversity and diverse teams can make a difference and can do better humanitarian work and better peace-building work. So with these few short remarks, let me just acknowledge that I have followed with great interest the debate, and we're looking forward to continue at different levels with the OSCE. I wanted also to highlight and to feedback to you that I just had a conversation, a very good conversation with the chairman in office a couple of days ago, and in whatever shape and format OSCE voices come to the Icrc, we appreciate the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maurer. I pass the floor now to Ambassador Chevik in case you'd like to respond to anything.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the support and good words about SMM. Today, I intended to give you a good picture of the realities of the ground. We are doing it daily, but I mean, the SMM chief monitor speaking about them, I thought would be effective. And I'm happy that it had an effect. And I especially thank to Ms. Henriksen and Mr. Federfeld. They mentioned today, the people are suffering. We have a line of contact. This is a military term. It is an old style, two sides facing each other through the trenches, through the deployment positions, posturing and looking face to face. So it is a line of contact between the military, but also it is a line of separation for the people. Families are divided, societies are divided, education system is divided, the medical system is divided, even vaccination is divided now in Ukraine. So it is good to explain these realities to the national stakeholders by parliamentarians, and I'm happy to learn that it is happening. So this will help because in the end, there needs to be talk to the interlocutors by everybody, not by just the formal mediators. We are, as SMM, is the eyes and ears of the international community on the ground, and we are happy, proud that our hard work is put into good use. On the gender perspective, of course, this is very important, and SMM has been trying to put gender perspective in all its activities. Today, we are happy. One of our monitors from Odessa, and I would like to give his name, Cornelius Nolan, has been selected as the gender champion of OSCE for 2021. Why I am happy? Because he's a man. It is not gender issues, is not a woman's issue. Every single human being has to think from the gender perspective. I have given you some interesting statistics. For example, the mine action. It may be surprising to some, but the most victims, I mean, a high majority of the victims of mines and UXOs are either men or boys. There are different impacts or different genders, and the more we are aware of this gender perspectives of everything going on, it would be more helpful to find the solutions. Of course, the participation of women and youngsters into problem-solving mechanisms are very important. We are working. That was one of the, frequently appearing theme. I'm happy that the parliamentarians are also working on this. I'm grateful for all these efforts, and I'm looking forward to work through this joint endeavors in the days to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chevik. Just before concluding this call, I wanted to pass the floor back to Vice President Kari Henriksen, who also serves as the rapporteur of our Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs Committee, mainly to see how the Assembly can take these things forward. Her and then also Chair Hajiani, just to conclude our discussion today. Please, Kari.
Thank you very much, and thank you to each and one of you for your reports or your statements today. I think it has been a very good debate, and it's very useful, and it is necessary that we talk about this, because the core in every conflict is that there are more than one truth. There are several truths, and I think we have to, in the work on the OSCE, divide between the solutions on the conflicts and the solutions and the efforts to reduce the violations on human rights issues and to fulfill our commitments regarding international law and human rights issues. Because I think we can't solve both in the same solutions. We have to divide them, and we have to be concrete in how we can make solutions to the humanitarian issues that we have discussed today. So that is my wish for the common work, is that we find solutions to the humanitarian issues, because every one of you today have pointed out how miserable people are when the conflict have consequences that involve their lives in a matter that we have been hearing today. So we have to find solutions on how we can go further on the humanitarian violations. And one of the possibilities is that we as parliamentarians raise these issues in our own government, parliaments, discuss it in the media, to make some suggestions on how we can get further. We have to join our efforts to make good solutions. And I look very much forward to how we can find these solutions in the common debates in the Human Rights Committee and in the OSCE as a whole. So I think I'm optimistic after this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then just for a concluding thought, I pass the floor back to Chair Hajiani, please.
Thank you, Mr. Baker, for your excellent coordination. Mr. President, dear colleagues, thank you very much for your contribution. I also would like to thank Mr. Maurer and Mr. Chevik for your work in such challenging contexts. I can assure you that we will strive to cooperate with you and offer our assistance as Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in alleviating suffering in conflict zones and promoting respect to the commitments that participating states have assumed in this area. We hope that the situation with COVID will improve soon and enable us to carry out visits in affected areas soon, so as to be able to see how people are actually affected and how we can bring more visibility or exert any influence so as to alleviate human suffering. Thank you very much, all of you. Good night.
Thank you very much. Also from our side here in Copenhagen, with that, I think we'll just say have a nice weekend, and we look forward to seeing you again, preferably in person, but otherwise virtually.